things come up, right? So this one came to me like a wave. It was calm at first and then unmistakable. I was at a retreat a couple of weeks ago in Maine. I had my laptop in front of me, and had started and sat down, at that retreat originally. And I thought I was going to be writing on this workbook, right? Creating this workbook. And Spirit told me that there were other plans for me. It was very loud. I had probably spent, I don't even know, 4 or 5 weeks prepping for this ritual to like prepare the things that I needed, right? To make sure that I was ready and that I'd be able to use this time. And Spirit on the drive down shifted that. And as I was sitting there and now working on this new project that they'd had me pivot into, I had this moment hit me that I hadn't thought of in a couple of years. I was around 11 years old, and I grew up in a Catholic church, right? I went to Catholic school for 13 years. I don't even know, I think for like 6 years probably in Girl Scouts, which is a Catholic program. And so I was around church a lot. And I had just seen, around 11 years old, girls my age serving as altar girls at another parish. And these girls weren't just like coming up and reading the scripture or just carrying gifts up. They were right there beside the priest, supporting the entire flow of Mass. And I was just so excited at this. My heart just like leaped. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to be able to serve God in a better way. I'm going to be able to serve right next to the priest. I felt called to do this, like something was kind of opening up for me. And so at our next Mass rehearsal, because I often would read scripture or carry the gifts up, I gathered my courage to approach our father, the pastor that led the church, the priest that led the church. And, I didn't talk to him a whole bunch. I'd see him. He was actually known to be like, he was known to be an alcoholic. Somehow or another, I even knew that as a kid, but I was excited. And I told him I wanted to serve with him up there at the altar, that I wanted to do more. And I thought he'd be proud of me. I really did. I thought he'd be proud. I thought he'd be excited. I thought that as, the head of the church, he would just be so warm to see someone want to serve in a better way, in this deeper way. And he looked at me straight in the eyes and just said, no, it's not possible. So I, of course, asked him why. And he said, not in my church. And that's when this hit me. I was so disappointed in that moment. I felt like my breath had been taken away. And then I was disgusted. What did he mean by his church? Because I thought this was God's house. It was in that moment that something had cracked in me, and I didn't have words for it at that time, but my spirit knew I had been shut out from something very sacred. Not because I didn't love God, not because I lacked any faith, but because I'd been born a girl. I didn't leave God that day, but something in me left the church. I kept going because I didn't have a choice, right? I attended the religious classes at the school. They were a requirement. But I began asking a lot of questions. A lot. The kind of questions that drove most teachers crazy. Things that they just shouldn't have to answer, right? I would question what we were reading, what we were studying, and I did in a number of classes question why girls weren't allowed to serve in the same way, why it depended upon the church. I wanted to understand what made someone worthy of being up at that altar in that way. And I wasn't trying to be difficult. I mean, maybe I was, but I was trying to find the divine again. I was trying to find some kind of answer, some understanding. But the more questions that I asked, the more I felt like I just didn't belong. At some point, I stopped volunteering to carry the gifts. I stopped reading at Mass. I stopped singing. I even stopped taking Eucharist. It all felt like I was pretending, and I just couldn't do it anymore. The joy that I had once felt participating in this ritual had been replaced by resentment, and I just pulled away. I was still just a child at that time, and during all of those years, my home life brought its own storms. There was trauma happening behind closed doors, things that I couldn't talk to my friends about, things that I didn't have a language for, things I needed comfort for and guidance for. And I thought that maybe the church would have been there to offer that if it, I don't know, made room for someone like me. But as a kid, I felt like the church had turned its back on me, and I didn't know where else to go. So I turned to books. I read a lot of books. I turned to art. And eventually, when I was 15, I turned to work. I buried myself in whatever it is that could fill the emptiness. I stayed away from the spiritual spaces that I knew, not because I didn't believe, but because I wasn't willing to be shut out again. And when I did attend Mass, when I had to, with school, weddings, funerals, with my parents, I was so overwhelmed. I'd sit in the pew and I would feel these waves of grief rise up that I didn't understand. And looking back, I think it was this feeling of sorrow of that little girl who still wanted to be close to God. But I was feeling something bigger. The collective heartbreak of every person who had been told, you don't belong here, not like that, not like you are. I was 16 when I found my way back to spirit. But it wasn't through a church. It wasn't through a program. It was through a door with a bell above it and a shop that smelled like incense and old wood. Books. It was the first metaphysical store that I'd ever stepped foot into. Once I did, something inside me exhaled, like I'd been holding my breath this entire time waiting. There were crystals and there were books and there were candles and there were herbs and there were people that didn't seem afraid to talk about magic or energy or the unseen. And no one there ever looked at me for being curious or asking too many questions. No one said, "Not in my store." Instead, there were shelves upon shelves of answers, or better yet, invitations to learn. There were private rooms in the back where psychics sat and would give you a reading. I didn't know everything that day. But I knew walking out of that store that first day that I was a witch. I knew that I believed in the elements and the wisdom of the earth and the kind of truth that rose up from within instead of down. I believed that healing wasn't something that we had to beg for. It was something we participated in. That we weren't born broken or dirty or sinful. We didn't have to be baptized to be clean. That divinity didn't live in a marble hall or have stained glass around it. That it lived in nature, in our bodies, in our choices. And it lived in me. So from that day forward, you can say I started building my own altar to serve at. Slowly and secretly, because I was still living at home. And I didn't feel safe about being open about it. But I started to collect things, books, stones, ribbons, candles, little tiny tools, and I hid them in my drawers. I had this old dresser, and the top two drawers were all of these things. Some things I would tuck under my bed or under my mattress. I'd wait till my parents were in bed to, sleep before I'd cast a spell. Over time, I moved out and the altar grew, became a whole shelf in my bedroom. It became the herbs that I kept in my kitchen, the oils, or the bath products that sit in my bathroom. It was the way that I lit a candle or pulled out cards whenever I needed guidance. And today, it's my entire home, my entire life. The thing that I find the most amazing, though, is right now, this altar that I have built, especially this altar up in the astral, is not just mine. It belongs to every single person out here that has ever been told they were too much, too different, too magical, too weird to belong. Everyone who's ever walked away from a church and wondered if they'd lost God, when really they were just stepping towards themselves and the divine that they knew existed. I now know that moment I was denied the altar wasn't a detour from my spiritual path. It was my spiritual path. That denial planted a seed in me. Not one of bitterness, though I felt that at first, but one of sacred defiance, of divine remembrance, of my soul knew something that day, even if I couldn't name it quite yet. It knew that I was never meant to serve at someone else's altar, that I was meant to build my own. And that truth came back full circle at that writing retreat. Like I said, I'd gone there thinking I was going to work on a workbook. And as I sat there and I had this memory hit, and I remembered that this was part of my spiritual path, I knew that it was time to introduce and build the sovereign phoenix. This is a religious fellowship for witches in recovery. I'd been dreaming it into form for a while. And it wasn't just an idea, it was an inevitable truth. It was something that had been set in motion when I was 11 years old. I see that really clearly now. The altar that I've built is not just candles and crystals and not just rituals and tools. It's actually a home. It's a home for every single witch in recovery who has ever been exiled. For every queer, neurodivergent, magical, or trauma-touched soul who is told they couldn't serve the divine in their fullness in some way, shape, or form. For every single person who's been turned away, not because they lacked faith, but because they carried a kind of power that made other people uncomfortable. My altar holds space for all of them, and it holds space for you. If I could speak to that younger version of myself right now, standing in her dress with her hand clasped, hoping, asking to serve God, I would look her straight in the eyes and say, keep searching. The truth is out there. You were never denied the divine. You were just rerouted to your destiny.